Hello everyone, the next speaker is Marieke van Vugt. And first, thanks for the performance of yesterday. It was emotional. Okay, she's an assistant professor in the cognitive modeling group at the University of Groningen, and she attended her postdoc in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And she studied mainly how we think, in what ways we mind wander, and indeed today she will talk on the challenge to detect mind wandering with the EEG classifier. Please, the stage is yours.
So yes, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me at this wonderful conference with so many exciting talks and posters and tutorials. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to a more cognitive approach.
I'm really, really sorry. Apparently you have a problem with online. Okay. Does someone see my mouth? Please tell me. I'm very sorry, huh? Let's take just a second. And the floor is yours.
So take two. Thank you so much. And it's important to care for the people online, so I fully support this action. So yeah, more cognitive approach. Before I dive into all of the data, let me acknowledge some of my students, and actually Hung is here at this conference, so you can hear more about it directly from the source. So without further ado, let's go into mind wandering, which might be something that you are experiencing right now after lunch at the end of the day. So we mind wander typically about 50% of the time. And yes, I thought let's put in a dreamy ballet picture of me, and this is what Groningen looks like, the city where I live. So mind wandering is clearly important, and how can we study this scientifically? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is mind wandering from a definitional standpoint, although that is a minefield. Then I will talk a little bit about how we can approach it from a model-based direction, and then I will go the other direction, approaching it from the data. And yeah, that's basically it. So you can see these complementary perspectives on where models can take us in the study of this very relevant phenomenon, but also extremely complex phenomenon, because it doesn't really like to be caught in tasks, as you will see now when we're defining mind wandering, which doesn't really have a singular definition, so that's great. Often people say it's task-unrelated thinking, or it's self-generated thoughts, or it's stimulus-independent thought. So all of this really already shows us that it's a process that sort of happens to us, but we cannot experimentally control, like in many of the other things that we're talking about at this conference, where we just manipulate the thing we're studying by giving people a task and then sort of playing around with it, turning its knobs. So the problem by definition with mind wandering, it's something that you do when you do not do the task, when you're sitting here that you're a bit tired and your mind sort of goes to the boat tour that we're having tonight, or just implanting a nice idea in your mind here, or anything else you might be wondering about. And no definition, unfortunately, has singular acceptance. But that's why I really like to go for computational modeling, because it provides a sort of more procedural definition, you could say. So yeah, let's go into, if mind wandering has no singular definition, how can we even then bring it into the lab? Well, it's still taking place, and it's also taking place in the lab almost half of the time, in fact. So what we can do to measure it is insert so-called thought probes into our experiments. And with thought probes, we basically ask people a self-report question every 30 to 90 seconds, in which we ask them, what were you thinking just now? And the nice thing of this question is that literally people don't need to think back, like, what did I do in the past hour? No, really just now. And they might have answer options like, I was thinking about the task, I was thinking about how I was doing on the task, I was thinking about external stimuli, I was thinking about myself, and so on. So multiple choice question. You can even ask further, like, I was thinking about the past, present, or future self or other, or a question that I really like, and we'll get back to that in the end. How difficult, it was a thought that was very difficult to disengage from, or a thought that was quite easy to disengage from. So what this looks like from the perspective of the participant is the following. So you get this task in which you have to press a button whenever you see an O, but withhold it when you see a Q. So now they would have been pressing the button. Q, okay, so hopefully they haven't pressed the button. More button pressing, button. Okay, what were you thinking about? So you can do that experiment yourself. Were you thinking about the task, performance on the task, distracted by the environment, daydreaming, or blanking, basically? And then the nice thing is that you can then take that answer and know that probably people were doing this, so thinking about the task or daydreaming for the maybe 10-15 seconds prior to that question. I mean, what happens the rest of the time, basically we have no idea, but at least probably for a short while before they answered this question, they were doing that. And then we can classify the task performance, the EEG, the eye tracking, or whatever we're measuring according to the responses on this question. And we can find out that, for example, people tend to do a bit, there's no cursor here. Oh yeah, there's this thing here. Yeah. So people tend to do a bit worse when they're reported to be mind wandering compared to when they're on task. So this is the difference between mind wandering and on task. And this actually generalizes between two different tasks. We're using one that's this OQ task, more or less, that I just presented. It's also called sustained attention to response task. And one was a visual search task. We chose these two tasks because the SART is one that doesn't require a lot of visual focus on the screen. So we wanted to also have a task where people really were sort of required to look on the screen, and we are curious whether the same kind of mind wandering occurred. And yeah, results are pretty similar between these two tasks. Also, you tend to see that people tend to respond a little bit more slowly. Or more variable. Actually, sometimes they respond faster. So this is, for example, in the SART. And the reason is that the SART is this go, no-go task where people easily get into habitual modes of responding, so that when they are starting to mind wander, they just start rhythmically tapping the response button, basically. Okay. There can also be, however, positive sides to mind wandering. So it's not all bad, and I would not vote at all for abandoning mind wandering, because sometimes this mind wandering provides you with better, more creative solutions to other tasks. Or what we've also shown in the lab is that it can be very helpful if you're doing one of these mind-numbingly boring tasks that we have people do in our labs. You might just as well think about other tasks in between, like more important stuff. And we've shown this also in a kind of planning task, which I will mention briefly if I have time. So this is mind wandering in the lab, very, very briefly. So how can we start to approach this using computational tools? Well, let's start with the model-based approach, which makes use of a model called ACT-R. And this is a so-called cognitive architecture, a fairly complex model of cognition, which basically says cognition is kind of like an algorithm, and we can implement it on a computer and then use that to make quantitative predictions for behavioral performance. So How do we get a computer to mind wander? Well, we do two things. We make a model of the person doing the task, then we make a model of the mind wandering, and then we put those together, and then we look at what happens to behavior when the model starts to mind wander. And then we adjust the model, just like all computational models of behavior, by comparing the human and the computer performance until they approximate each other as much as possible. So the main principles of this model of mind wandering are that mind wandering is predominantly a memory recall process. So what I'm showing here in this kind of a figure is that basically it's actually, this is better. There we go. So I've shown you the situation of a task. So you're paying attention with your beautiful spotlight to a task stimulus. And meanwhile, there is this thought pump that's happening in your head that's generating all kinds of memories or thoughts. So if you go back to the boat trip idea, the boat trip is sort of playing around in the back of your head. And it competes for attention. So for as long as you have some kind of metacognition going on, that's like, okay, where am I focusing on? I have to focus on this stupid task. Then you should be fine. But this is probably going to go weaker over time. And then the boat trip or something else will be capturing your attention. And then one memory will retrieve the next and the next and the next, until you suddenly hit upon this memory of like, oh, I'm supposed to be attending, and you get back to the main task. So yeah, this is also supported by some fMRI evidence, which shows that mind wandering is predominantly a memory recall process, or sorry, that you see sort of this increased medial temporal lobe activity, especially at the moments that people report to be mind wandering. And yeah, the competition seems to make a lot of sense. So how do we simulate this? Well, we simulate this in a cognitive architecture that's called ACT-R, which consists of these different modules that are each linked to a particular brain area. Of course, this is a very rough linkage, and those of you who have very intimate knowledge of the brain will probably completely frown at this, but it's a reasonable first approximation. So there is a module, for example, that takes care of visual perception, which is placed, well, depending on the task, more in occipital cortex or fusiform gyrus. There is sort of long-term memory retrieval. There's something about goal monitoring, which is roughly associated with anterior cingulate motor cortex, which would implement manual responses, and so on and so forth. So you have all these components, and with these components, you can write computer code that looks kind of archaic. I mean, speaking of archaic, this is really archaic. This is in Lisp. So basically, the traditional version of the ACT-R models are if-then rules that interact with cognitive resources. Nowadays, there is also a Python implementation, so yay. So, for example, this would be one of the if-then rules in my model that says, okay, if my goal is getting distracted, so I restore my goal in the memory system, then I'm setting a new sub-goal, which is being distracted. And when I get distracted, I have to remember items. And then I have to actually retrieve an item, a memory from my memory store, one that's not been recently retrieved. And I clear my working memory and then move on to the next if-then rule. So you can generate mind wandering this way, and then let the memory model interact with the task model and predict responses and response times, and put together the model so that it predicts performance on the task that I just showed you. So the sustained attention to response task, where roughly what will happen is that when the model part of the model, so the task part of the model is active, it will just properly see the stimulus, perceive the stimulus, retrieve the memory, the stimulus response rule, and then press the button accordingly, or not press the button when it's a cue. If, on the other hand, the thought pump or the mind wandering part is active, then whatever happens, it will just do its habitual thing, which is pressing the button, and that means that whenever you get a cue, it will make an error. Okay, so this is just a very boring kind of model. Let's see how it does. It can predict basic behavior. So here, what I'm showing in these different graphs are the data in gray and the simulation in white, and it roughly gets the accuracy and response time and variability of response time correct, although the model is a little bit more enthusiastic. It has a slightly slower response times, but most importantly, it gets the fraction of being on task pretty much correct. So just like the real person, the model is on task about 60% of the time and mind wandering about 50% of the time. And it can even tell us whether it's thinking about the past, present, and future. So this is the very basic version of the mind wandering model. And it's obviously purely cognitive, but I've not in the context of mind wandering related it directly to EEG data, but in the context of an attentional blink task, I have made direct links from the different cognitive resources of these ACT-R models to brain oscillations. So potentially that can still be done, just haven't gotten to it. What I do want to mention, go into here though, is some things that I recently got interested in that I think is a really interesting application of these computational models, which are trying to understand psychiatric problems. And one that I'm particularly interested in, because I think it has very close ties to mind wandering, is depressive rumination. Because whereas you can see that, well, normally our daydreaming or mind wandering is fairly adaptive. I mean, sometimes you just get a little bit worse on boring tasks, but, you know, I think in a way that's not too bad. Could be worse. It can also, on the other hand, help us be creative or do some planning. There is also this maladaptive kind of daydreaming, which is when the mind wandering, the daydreaming becomes narrowly focused, uncontrolled, repetitive thinking, mostly say negative and self-referential, and people can really get stuck in that. And it is actually a sustaining feature of depression, and even sometimes a factor that can initiate a new depressive episode. Christoff actually calls it also a constrained kind of mind wandering, because it's the kind of mind wandering that is not flexible. It's probably not the kind of mind wandering that can give you creative ideas. You just get stuck more and more, sort of you're digging yourself more and more in one hole. So if we have this basic model of mind wandering, how would we change it so that we can explain this phenomenon of rumination? So we could actually do two very simple things and then produce a behavior that was consistent with what's generally reported in this mind wandering in the depression literature. So one thing we did was just increasing the amount of chunks that had a negative valence. So sorry, chunks is ACT-R speak. It's really just memories that the model has. And also I just increased the connections between the memories that were negatively valenced. And that meant that when this model goes into its mind wandering, it will cycle more between all the memories that are negatively valenced and are therefore more tightly connected. So what we then find is that the accuracy on the same SAR task of the depressed model is significantly lower than of the control model, which is consistent with behavioral data in general from depressed patients that just show more difficulty concentrating on tasks. Actually, interestingly enough, we did not observe a difference in the fraction of being on task. And we also did not observe a difference between the variability of the response times. But at least it was, the pattern was consistent with some data that we actually collected afterwards as well. So we made the predictions before we collected the data and were able to predict these kind of effects. So that's just one example of how you can use these computational models to then think about, you know, what happens in a different kind of situations. And then, since I promised you that I would also talk about the good side of mind wandering, so to end on a more positive note for the cognitive stuff, for the model-based stuff, mind wandering can also be useful for planning, because many of our task-related thoughts are actually about the future. So if you look at, this is data from Ruby and colleagues, who just report, how much do people report thinking about the future or the past, or how in general off-task, self-related, other-related, then you can see that actually people spend quite a bit of time thinking about the future, and also quite a bit of positive thinking. And actually, typically, future and positive also tend to be somewhat related. So we spend a good deal of time thinking about the future, and I can certainly say from my own first-person experience that when I find I'm mind-wandering, I'm typically making lots of plans. And so we wondered, do those reflect planning? And we came up with a kind of paradigm to measure this in the lab. I can tell you it's really, really complex to do so. But basically, what we did was we said, okay, here you're doing a stupid, boring task. I think it was an end-back task. And then here we tell you that, after a little while on this end-back task, you're going to switch to this screen where we tell you to do a very complex task in which you have to make a combination of these instructions and apply them to these words. I'm not going to bore you exactly with the format of the task, but basically that's the essence of it. And then we wondered whether people would be better if they sometimes looked at this other screen while they were doing this task. So we actually measured their eye tracking. Here, I would say eye tracking is actually much better than EEG because you can get at the relevant process more directly. And we showed that there was a benefit in the cases that people had actually prepared, had started to look at this other task. So of course, it's not directly asking people about their mind wandering, but sort of deriving it from where they're looking. But sometimes that has to be done because otherwise you're distorting the task process so far. We, however, also did show large individual differences. So some people almost never seem to plan in the task. Other people tend to plan all the time and everything in between. And this is probably also something that we find very generally in the mind-wandering literature. Some people report mind-wandering almost all the time, some people almost never. So this is how you can study mind-wandering from the perspective of our cognitive theories, which we can then turn into simulatable computational theories and predict behavior, which in theory we can also then use to analyze EEG data, as I talked about in my tutorial this morning. But we haven't done that yet for mind wandering. So instead, what we've done with mind wandering is using more data-driven approaches. This is my follow-up on Alexandre's nice presentation that we just heard, namely asking the question, can we track mind wandering in the brain? Again, because people do not mind wander on command, and we know that people mind wander some proportion of the time in the task. We can find it out by asking them every 30 to 90 seconds, but we can certainly not know it every moment, because then people would go crazy. I mean, you could theoretically ask them every 5 seconds whether they're mind wandering, but then they wouldn't even have enough time to wander off. So yeah, there would be no mind wandering in such a task. So maybe EEG is a kind of a solution. So what we can do is still give them the same boring task or some version of this boring go, no-go task. So, you see a stimulus, and then every so often, and then there's a couple of seconds in between the stimuli. So this is on average like 1.9 seconds or so. And then every so often there's in this case, capitalized words, and you have to withhold pressing the button on this capitalized word. So again, very simple, very slow task. Every so often we put a thought probe. And now the function of the thought probe is again to label the trials just prior to it according to their responses on this thought probe. And we also do the same with this visual search task, where people just get a search panel and have to indicate whether the target is in the search panel. And then also sometimes there's the thought probe, and they have to say, and then we classify these trials according to the responses on the thought probe. So these are our examples for the classifiers. As Alexandre also recommended, we started with very simple classifiers because never start with complex deep learning kind of stuff. And, you know, we have also not infinite amounts of data, I think more on the order of 25 or so participants. So we train a classifier by giving them many examples of the two classes, mind wandering and on task, and then the computer learns the mapping between the EEG activity in the class. This is machine learning for dummies. So in this case, we like to use a support vector machine. We tried out a bunch of different classifiers, but the support vector machine with a radial basis function seemed to work best. So the radial basis function is nice because it allows for some nonlinear mappings, but the support vector machine is really still simple enough to give you, reasonable for the machine learning not to go off, basically. And we then tested how well the classifier does on new EEG data. So basically we used, cross-validation and all of that fun stuff. And of course, the nice thing of such machine learning methods, it can make predictions for single trials. So the first study, what we did was we ran this machine learning classifier on individual subject data, because as I said, there's large individual differences. So we tried an across-subject classifier in the first study, but it didn't really work. So we did instead within subject classifiers, and here what you will see is for every participant in the study, there was a classifier, and this is the accuracy. So this is 50%, this dashed line, which is almost invisible, sorry. So most of them are somewhat above chance. The different colors are different classifiers. So and this is actually an interesting bit, I think, of this study. We did classifiers that were trained on the SART task and then tested on the SART task. We did another classifier that's, the orange one is trained and tested on SART. The green one is trained and tested on visual search. So they're the same kind of trials. And you can see that the orange and the green one are doing pretty well. So then we are like, okay, let's see whether these classifiers are very task specific or can they generalize? So is this EEG pattern that we're picking up here, is that a generic pattern for mind wandering, or is it something specific about this task? And so what we did was in purple, we trained on SART and tested on visual search, and blue, we trained on visual search and tested on SART. And interestingly enough, you can see that the blue and purple are very often quite comparable in accuracy to the trained and tested classifiers within the same task. So these seem to be very generalizable classifications of mind wandering. So you might then wonder, what in the EEG is it picking up on? So then we looked at these different parts, or we tried to identify what part it was by comparing the accuracy of the classifiers based on all data to accuracy of classifiers based on only one feature of the data. So that would be, for example, only the amplitude of the P1 or the N1 or alpha oscillations in only one electrode. So actually what I should mention here in this machine learning study is that it's a bit of an atypical machine learning study in that we didn't go with just throw all the data that you can think of in there. Instead, we went to the mind-wandering literature, the mind-wandering EEG literature, looked at the different kinds of features that people had identified with mind-wandering, and those were going to be the components we're going to throw into our EEG machine learning classifier. And those features were like occipital alpha, midfrontal theta, N1, P1, and P3, and then also some functional connectivity. So between these, we then did, from all the electrodes that were identified, We then looked at also the synchrony between all of them in alpha and theta. So these are basically, this is the list of all the EEG markers that we got. And then if you look at what are the most, at the highest accuracy features, then you can see that really posterior alpha is a big one. And alpha and C21, so it's a little frontal alpha, and the P3. And the other ones are much, much lower. So yeah, occipital alpha, mind wandering, yes. So that's one study. We then, went a little further in using the machine learning to understand the cognitive processes underlying mind wandering. So what we did in this study was we compared 3 different hypotheses for what can generate mind wandering, because we know that mind wandering tends to occur when there are low task demands. We also know that mind wandering tends to occur in situations with low vigilance, especially after lunch or at the end of the task. So obviously we couldn't withhold people their lunch and test them before and after lunch. So instead what we did was we compared beginning and end of task performance. And then, of course, we have the self-report data from, these questions that were asked in the middle of the task. And so we're wondering, like, if you train a classifier on low versus high task demands, is it then allowing you to predict the mind-wandering self-reports from the thought probes? Or if we train a classifier on low versus high vigilance situations, does it then allow us to predict the self-report probes? And that's what these data are looking at. So here is the accuracy for just the training of the classifiers themselves. So blue is the classifier for task demands, the pink is for vigilance, and the green for self-report. So all of them are above chance. That's what these stars indicate. This is cross-validation. This is leave one participant out cross-validation. So, this is a situation with individual subject classifiers. This is actually a group classifier where we trained it on all but one participant and tested on the left-out participant. So actually in this study, we were able, thankfully, to make a generalizable model. And then we took these trained classifiers and tried to predict the self-reports. Obviously, the self-reports could be predicted by the self-reports, so these classifiers are doing well. But there was no prediction whatsoever of task demands and vigilance classifiers for the self-reports of mind wandering. So this suggests that although these processes appear to be related, actually, neurally speaking, or EEG neurally speaking at least, they do not seem to overlap very much. So that was, I think, an interesting way to use classifiers. So you can use them to look at the relationships between different cognitive variables that you're interested in. Then actually, in the context, again, of the previous talk, this is kind of interesting. We try to apply the magic of deep learning. Maybe we should have used the brain decode toolbox, but, what we did was just self-implement or, use classifiers from the Keras library to try to see maybe deep learning is going to increase the accuracy a little bit, because the problem is that, as you saw, we never got much above 65% accuracy. So it's above chance, but it's really not that fantastic. So maybe deep learning is going to help us out here, since, deep learning is based on a hierarchical process, so classifiers that have multiple layers, and nonlinear transformations that happen on the data in each layer. So it really has a lot of power. So we trained a bunch of classifiers, actually compared a couple of different classifier architectures. Not going to bother you exactly with what those were. But basically, these were also derived on this lovely review that Alexander also mentioned, the one by Roy and colleagues from 2019. We looked up, okay, what do people use in the literature? And we sort of built variants of those architectures. And then we actually put the data from 3 experiments we did before together. So we really had this quite large data set. And well, the short story is that the deep learning did not really help too much. So these are the accuracies based off the, well, the validation accuracy, the training accuracy in blue. So the blue is the training accuracy. So that's just telling us whether the classifier learned anything. But the validation is really what's interesting, because this is how well it actually predicts unseen data. And you can see that it gets a little bit better, you know, maybe at most about 70%, but yeah, it's not doing magic like getting you to 80 or 90%. The other interesting thing to notice here is that these are, we separated the process for raw EEG, oscillatory power, synchronization, and single trial ERPs. And what we found is that actually the deep learning worked best on the raw EEG data. So whereas the previous classification, we had a lot of success with the single trial ERP. So actually the P3 that I mentioned was based on the single trial ERP P3. Oscillatory power was also very successful previously. And with deep learning, not so much. So the deep learning really does these data transformations themselves. So don't give it the transformed EEG data. So that was a helpful thing to learn for us as sort of, I guess, more dummy users of this deep learning. So as I said, accuracy does not improve much over 70%, but it does best on unprocessed data. So it's an alternative almost data processing method. And the important thing that I didn't mention yet is that it did allow us to generalize across experiments. So we could train the classifier on data from one experiment and then actually test it on data from a completely new experiment with even, I guess, all of the data were from biosemi EEG setups, but the one was from a 128 channel setup and the other one was from a 32 channel setup. So for what we did with that was that from the 128, we selected the corresponding 32 channels, but basically still it was generalizable to a completely different set of participants and obviously also a completely different recording setup. So we thought that that was pretty cool. So yeah. Classifying mind wandering is difficult. So then, you know, after trying out to improve the machine learning bit, we thought, well, maybe we should instead try to work on the quality of the data because, well, there's the famous saying, garbage in, garbage out. You know, you can use very famous, powerful machine learning classification, but if your data are not if your data are garbage, then you're still going to get nonsense. And obviously, that's a big problem in mind-wandering research because you have to rely on self-report data from individual participants, and they might not, even if they intend to, they might not always be accurate at judging their own mental state. And you also don't get as many trials as you would want to. So that makes it difficult. So maybe can we strengthen the signal? One idea we had was using this steady state visual evoked potential to track attention. So we basically modified this SART task by adding a 12.5 hertz flicker of the stimuli that the participants had to respond to. And we thought that, well, maybe mind wandering would be associated with a decreased neural response to the flicker. So the short answer is, well, not so much. So these are data that were still, still in the submission stage. So basically what we found was if we compared the neural response to this flickering stimulus, red is on task, blue is mind wandering. Well, you can clearly see no difference. This is just enlarge that also. Also at the harmonic of 12.5 hertz, not much of a difference. So yeah, it's not that great. And then not surprisingly, if we fit a classifier to that, that also did not really improve by including the steady state visual evoked potential. Now, one reason that we might not have shown a difference is that also we didn't see much of a difference in behavior between on task and mind wandering. So we are wondering, well, you know, what if instead of that, we look at something else in the self-reports that might actually that do show some difference in behavior. So thankfully, we also asked people whether they found it easy to disengage from their thoughts and more difficult to disengage from their thoughts. And actually here we did see differences in behavior. And interestingly enough, then also the steady state visual evoked potential started to distinguish a little bit between these. So when people found it quite easy to disengage from their thought, the steady state visual evoked potential, at least at 25 hertz, at least at 12.5 hertz, was a little bit higher than when they were very much engrossed in their thoughts. Still, the classifier did not improve by including the steady state visual evoked potential. Yeah, I guess we have to continue trying to improve our data to see whether we can improve our classifier. So one of the things that I'm interested in trying, for example, is seeing whether people that are better at judging their own mental states might generate better data. So there's a little bit of evidence, for example, that people who have spent a good deal of time observing their own mind, like in mindfulness or meditation practice, are better at BCIs, or can more relate higher or generate higher accuracies in BCI. So maybe they can help us with mind wandering research, but to be continued. So in conclusion, I've shown you that mind wandering can suitably be modeled as a task that's in competition with the main task and that generates reasonable accuracies and response times. Mind wandering is harmful when it takes up resources that cannot be used for the task. Mind wandering can also be helpful when it uses the unused time for planning of upcoming tasks. But detecting mind wandering in EEG is challenging, and deep learning and SSVEP don't help much. So there is still a lot of work to do. So I guess we have time for a few burning questions. Thank you.
I was wondering, you used stickiness. You controlled stickiness. Asked the question about this, and for your model of depression, you used it as something you can model. And so, did you see any change in the data for people with depression in the stickiness to their thought? And was it something you looked into?
Yeah, great question. We're actually currently running, so we have data in another experiment where we compare healthy and, well, not fully depressed individuals, but a bit more depressed individuals where we do see some differences. And we're now running a clinical trial where we compare fully depressed individuals with healthy individuals. So we will see, and actually there we're also collecting EEG data while they're doing this SOAR task, so we can see both behaviorally as well as in the EEG data and eye tracking and heart rate variability and daily experience sampling, how they are different in their thought processes. Whoa.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. I was wondering about the way that you measure mind wandering, obviously. So the self-report, and I was asking myself why using these tasks where you then show differences in performance, because my feeling would be if I make a mistake in a task and then afterwards you ask me whether I was mind wandering, I might say yes, even though I wasn't, right? As an kind of, or maybe I might even believe in it, but it could be a post hoc thing because you always ask them afterwards. So whether people might be more honest about whether they're mind wandering or looking at a stimulus if it's not a task, but something where they don't have to perform.
Right. No, that's a great point. And actually, there's been some work recently on this, trying to compare different kind of paradigms. Actually, it's also been used, for example, in a reading task. So that's a bit more of a naturalistic task where you can just every so often insert this kind of a thought probe and at the same time sort of measure performance unobtrusively by turning the text into gibberish at some point and then see how long it takes before they start to detect that it's become gibberish. So yeah, I've just used these tasks because they are more commonly used in the mind-wandering literature. So even if they're not perfect, I mean, I guess that's you got to start somewhere. And I guess hopefully at some point we can also do real-time EEG or so, where you might track these kind of biomarkers of mind-wandering and then ask people if we see a high level of, say, occipital alpha, what are they thinking? Maybe the other way around would be a little bit more valid in that sense.
Hi, I had a question about the EEG features that you submitted into your classifiers and so on. I saw there was some, alpha and different frequency bands, and maybe there was some connectivity between different channels. Because I was wondering whether or not it would make sense to run an entire kind of network-based analysis on the EEG so as to kind of try to quantify the integrity of, say, a pattern that looks like the default mode network or something like that. And one could imagine that the strength or integrity of that network pattern would wax and wane potentially as a function of mind wandering. And so, yeah, I just wondered if it might make sense to do a lot of kind of that connectivity analysis in advance and send those kind of higher order features into the classifier.
Yeah, so what we've done, of course, is just go with the connectivity between the electrodes that we knew from previous studies. And I would love to hear more opinions from people here about what the EEG correlates are of the default network. I think so far from what I've read, it seems to be mostly this occipital alpha, which we clearly get here. And the connectivity related to that doesn't really seem to differentiate. And I would also be worried that if I throw too many features in there, it's just too much noise for the classifiers to make sense of. So, yeah.
I have two questions, but maybe first, I was wondering, what's your intuition about assuming that the SSVEP response, or the response to the SSVEP then decreases when you're mind wandering? Because I guess that somehow the intuition is that you're basically paying not that much attention, but I would argue that like SSVEP could also be just a response to the visual input, and that there's not so much about processing this flickering light, it's just the visual input. And as long as you're still looking at it, maybe the response just doesn't go down because it's not so much important that you actually pay so much attention to it as long as you get the visual input. And then the second question would be maybe a follow-up comment on the first question. I really like that you have this model, and I was wondering if there's any clinical implication to that. So could you, for example, use that as you showed that there's a difference in depressed people who are suffering from depression and like normal people. And could you, for example, use that model then to somehow, for example, predict the relapse rate for a new depression period?
Yeah, so awesome questions. So for the first one, the intuition of the SSVEP, basically the idea is that there's quite some evidence that during mind wandering, people just direct their attention more inwards and not so much for processing. So even in this very stupid sustained attention to response task. So I guess that's the intuition, that we're just capturing that maybe slightly more sensitively, but maybe not. And then the second one, for predicting relapse, I haven't yet figured out a way that I could actually use it. I would love to, so I'm still thinking about that. But what we can use it for, and I've started to do, is we have this now sort of the ruminative mind wandering model and the non-ruminative mind-wandering model, we can insert that in different kinds of tasks and then make predictions for how are they impaired on a working memory task or on a free recall task. So you can generalize this one process between many different kind of task situations to map out more precisely for where you would expect impairments in these individuals with this very, very simple model framework. And actually with the depressive relapse, I would still say I'm thinking about how to predict that, but maybe the way that we're thinking about it right now more is two areas. One, I guess maybe there's something changing in the EEG activity. So from our clinical trial, we can look at that. The other thing is in the clinical trial, what we're also doing is asking participants every day to do this mini version of a cognitive task. And then we want to see whether performance on that, even though it's only a few trials, but it is every day. So we can already generate some expectations for the baseline of this participant. Can it predict declines in depressive situation?
I also have two questions. I will try to be short. First of all, in that task where you used this boring working memory task and asked participants to switch to more interesting task, I was wondering if, I think would be really interesting to check whether people use different strategies to solve working memory task, and was it somehow connected to the tendency to mind wander? I mean, how they spread the resources during the task and in between. And the second was about this rumination and depression model. I know that people with depression, especially with depression that is caused by trauma or PTSD, they also have so-called maladaptive daydreaming, which is also can be intrusive, but it's not necessarily negative. It can be highly positive and very creative. But on the other hand, it's still intrusive, and it's also associated strongly with depression. So maybe if this model could also include the positive component of daydreaming, which highly intrusive and prevents people from doing their daily cognitive routine tasks.
Interesting. Yeah, so for different strategies, I would say that we've not, during this kind of a task, during the start task, there are not that many strategies. I guess, well, there is effectively a different strategy people are using when they're mind wandering, which is just pressing a button whenever they have some remote idea there's a button on the screen. During a complex working memory task, we actually did look at this and hypothesized and also modeled performance on this complex working memory task, where normally people would be using the time in between stimuli to continuously rehearse the letter they had to remember, whereas when they're mind wandering, they're using that same time to mind wander, so they're not rehearsing, and therefore that's why they're impaired, and that's consistent with the data. So for depression, that's a very intriguing question about the positive benefits of ruminative thinking. And yes, we haven't thought about that, but it's definitely something interesting to consider. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks again for the great talk.